Just days after Lehman Brothers had failed, the financial system was on the brink of total collapse. Hank Paulson, the Treasury Secretary, working with Federal Reserve Chairman Ben Bernanke, put together a last-ditch effort to save the American economy. They met with leaders in Congress and asked for $700 billion and no strings attached. The plan was to use the money to buy the toxic mortgage-related assets from investment banks, to take them off their books and calm the nerves of their depositors, freeing up cash and getting the credit system moving again. But it wasn't clear at the time that this would even work. To make sure he had the ability to change course, Secretary Paulson asked for total discretion over how the funds would be used. Congress found this difficult to accept. The investment banks had taken on too much risk and made bad investments, and now taxpayers were being asked to bail them out while the typical American wasn't getting any help at all. They asked for the weekend to think about it, and they would reconvene on Monday. Ben Bernanke is reported to have replied, "If we don't do this, we won't have an economy on Monday." On Monday, the Dow Jones dropped significantly after the opening bell on the news that Lehman was just the first domino to fall and massive institutions like AIG were at risk. Speaker Nancy Pelosi brought the bill to a vote, and there was a brief rally as many saw this as a sign that she believed the bill would pass. But as the votes were counted, it became clear that President Bush and Secretary Paulson had been unsuccessful in convincing fellow Republicans of the urgent need for the plan. As the fate of the bill became clear, the stock market plummeted and eventually closed down 777 points for the day, one of the largest single-day drops in the history of the index. The immediate and unrelenting turmoil in financial markets convinced those who had their doubts, and a week later, Congress passed the bill as credit markets froze and major corporations who had no hand in the mortgage crisis were finding it difficult to finance their day-to-day operations. Everyone was running out of cash, and no one was lending. While Congress had given Paulson the money, he needed to take big actions. The problems had accelerated to the point where the plan to buy toxic assets just wasn't going to work fast enough to prevent the collapse. Instead, Paulson assembled the heads of 9 of the largest banks in the country and told them that the United States government was going to be buying stock in their companies, injecting them with cash that they could then use to make loans and get credit flowing again. Having learned from the mistakes of the Reconstruction Finance Corporation during the Great Depression, which had published the names of the banks it made emergency loans to, thus signaling to the market their weakness and ensuring their demise, Paulson insisted that all of the banks take the money. That way, the healthy banks who weren't in trouble could shield the ones that were. If everyone took the money, people wouldn't know which ones were really in a weak position. They initially infused them with $125 billion in cash, but in the end, around $416 billion would be spent, with bailouts for AIG, automakers, and the eventual purchase of the toxic mortgage-related securities. Because the money was used to buy preferred stock, which was later bought back, TARP returned the taxpayer money it used in the end. Although financial Armageddon had been averted, the hopes that the capital injections would resuscitate the credit markets were overly optimistic. Lending remained frigid, and the impact rippled through the economy and sunk the U.S. into the worst recession since the Great Depression. It was one of the longest lasting in modern times. Real GDP fell by 4%, and unemployment peaked at over 10%, remaining over 9% until the fall of 2011. In a survey of the top economists around the country, there was unanimous agreement that the recession would have been worse without the TARP program, though the economist Austin Goolsbee summed up how most felt, saying, "The fact that it was necessary doesn't mean we should be happy about it." Irrational exuberance had led investment bankers to turn a blind eye to the risks they were taking, But rather than bearing the burden of their mistakes, the bankers were saved, while regular people lost their jobs and their businesses. Unlike the Great Depression, the Federal Reserve did not sit on their hands. They took quick and decisive action, driving interest rates down with open market purchases and stimulating the economy. But for the first time since their inception, the Fed hit a wall in the zero lower bound. By the end of 2008, they had set a target for the federal funds rate of 0, and there was nowhere lower to go. Negative interest rates, while a theoretical possibility, are hard to implement in real life. A negative interest rate implies that the lender is actually paying you to borrow money. It would be as if I lent you $100, which you would pay me back in a week, but every day of that week I gave you $1 for borrowing my money. No lender is actually going to do that. They'll just keep the cash themselves. At this zero lower bound, open market operations had reached the limit of their usefulness. The Fed had to start buying different assets, which would push down other longer-term interest rates in a process called quantitative easing. In the preceding years, even Keynesian economists had abandoned the idea of using fiscal policy in a recession. It wasn't that they thought it wouldn't work, it was just that there was nothing fiscal policy could do that monetary policy couldn't. But with monetary policy at its limit, new Keynesians started to call for government spending to aid the economy in its recovery. With the election of President Barack Obama just months after the financial crisis had played out, those economists got their wish. The American Recovery and Reinvestment Act spent $500 billion in an effort to put people back to work and also gave almost $300 billion in tax cuts. But aggregate demand had fallen by over $2 trillion, and many worried that this would not be enough. In the end, economists remained divided on the issue. The American economy recovered very slowly from this recession, and in many ways still hasn't fully recovered. It appears to have had a long-run impact on the makeup of the labor supply, and it hastened declines in many sectors of the economy which were slowly losing out to foreign competition. Economic policy had, since the Great Depression, made recessions less frequent and less severe, but short memories and hubris had driven the consensus among economists to a belief that instability was not inherent in the system. The financial crisis in 2008 had proven them wrong.